This video is part 10 in a series about Super Nintendo Entertainment System features. Here we'll introduce the SNES's audio subsystem, including the SPC700 CPU, the audio-digital signal processor, and audio RAM. This video will mainly focus on the connection between the SNES CPU and the SPC700 CPU and how they manage to communicate with each other. There will be an entirely separate series of videos about the Super Nintendo's audio subsystem and how music and sound effects are driven and played, so that won't be covered here. After looking at the communication link between the two CPUs, we'll conclude with analyzing the SPC700's boot ROM and how the subsystem is initialized. The Super Nintendo has an entire subsystem intended for handling audio, including, but not limited to, decompressing and interpreting music data, loading music tracks, and actually playing music and sound effects. This is all possible due to the hardware on board the console: a digital to analog converter, 64 kilobytes of RAM, the SDSP chip, the digital signal processor, and of course the SSMP chip, a CPU that is commonly referred to as the SPC700 CPU because it implements the SPC700 instruction set. The CPU also contains an embedded 64-byte boot ROM, which includes some code that executes on initial startup. On older models of the SNES, the entire audio subsystem was located on a smaller daughter board that was enclosed in a metal shield box. It was later relocated onto the main motherboard, and even newer revisions combined all of these chips into one, labeled as the SAPU chip. The SPC700 CPU, which I'll refer to as the SPC for the rest of this video, is responsible for communicating with the SNES's main CPU and for actually running relevant music-related code. However, it is still just a processor, so it could also run other calculations if desired. The 64 kilobytes of RAM, often referred to as ARAM, is where music-related data is stored, and is also the general-purpose memory that can be used by the SPC. Instrument samples need to be stored here for the DSP to be able to access them, and it is also where the echo buffer is allocated when enabled via the DSP. Song data and sound effect data are usually stored here as well. ARAM is also where executable code to be run by the SPC is located. Since it can't be read off the game's ROM on its own, that code needs to be transferred into ARAM first to be ran. The DSP, as its name implies, processes the digital audio signal. It has over 100 different registers that control exactly what sound to produce on its 8 channels. After feeding it parameters like volume, pan, sample index, pitch, ADSR envelope, echo delay, and more, it outputs a digital signal for the left and right audio channels. Finally, the DAC takes these two signals and converts them to analog signals, which are what ultimately find their way through the red and white cables that plug into your TV. The benefit of having this subsystem dedicated to audio is that it offloads work from the main CPU and allows it to dedicate more execution time to gameplay-related code. Since gameplay code and audio code can be executed simultaneously, they won't affect one another. For example, if the main CPU is overloaded for a period of time, the sounds won't bog down while the game is lagging. This was a frequent issue with games on the NES, where the main CPU was also responsible for driving music. Even though these two CPUs could run independently, they still had to communicate with one another somehow if you wanted any music or sound effects to react to certain events during gameplay. The SNES did this via 4 8-bit input-output registers that connect the CPU to the APU. On the CPU side, these 4 registers are accessed by writing to or reading from address hex 2140 through 2143. On the APU side, they are accessed by writing or reading addresses hex F4 through F7. All of the data that finds its way from one processor to the other ultimately goes through one of these 4 ports. This means that large chunks of data, like song data, have to be broken down and sent in pieces, usually done byte by byte, one at a time. While there are 4 ports to send and receive data, there are actually 8 byte-sized buffers within the APU, 2 bytes for each port. One byte is used to hold the incoming data from the CPU, and one is used to hold the outgoing data from the APU. When a register like hex 2140 is read by the CPU, the data in the outgoing buffer is read, and when it is written to, the data in the incoming buffer is overwritten. And just the opposite happens on the APU side. When a register like hex F4 is read, the data in the incoming buffer is read, and when written to, the data in the outgoing buffer is overwritten. Because of this, each port can be read from or written to at the same time on either end, and nothing out of the ordinary happens. But an issue does arise when one side is reading when the other is writing to the same port. Since the 8-bit value in the register changes while it is being read, the resulting value afterwards has the chance of being corrupted. The most likely result is the logical OR of the old and new values due to how the internal circuitry works. Therefore, the code that governs how the two processors communicate should be sure that this never happens, or to debounce the input. In other words, read the value more than once to make sure it settles on a certain value before doing anything with it. The APU comes with its own boot ROM, which is just a small chunk of code that runs when the system first turns on. This code gets run before any communication with the SNES's main CPU happens, and is located in ARAM at addresses hex FFCO through FFFF. Again, since the main code that the SPC will be running during a game is located in the game's ROM on the cartridge, this too had to be sent to the APU through the input-output registers. The boot ROM is what runs initially, before this code finds its way into ARAM. Being only 64 bytes long, the functionality of the boot ROM has to be very simple. It can be broken up into 5 parts. The first part simply sets the stack pointer register to hex EF, which makes the bottom of the stack at address hex 1EF. The second part clears out the first page of memory by writing 0 to addresses 0 through hex EF. Addresses hex F0 through FF are mapped to internal registers instead of memory, which is why those are left out. The third part puts the SPC in a waiting state. It writes the special magic numbers hex AA and BB to the first and second I/O registers, then continuously checks the first I/O port for the SNES to respond with hex CC. The fourth part runs after the SNES responds and is responsible for actually transferring the data over. The last part is simply a single 16-bit pointer, the reset vector, which is hard-coded to hex FFCO, which is the start of the boot ROM. Although the APU comes bundled with this boot ROM, it still requires a compatible algorithm on the SNES's side in order to successfully transfer data over. This had to be included as part of the game's code in the cartridge ROM. There is a sort of protocol that the APU boot ROM expects from the algorithm on the SNES's side, so let's go over that now. One or more blocks of data can be sent within one transfer event. Each block of data is paired with the location in ARAM where the data should be transferred to. After all of the blocks of data are sent, one more ARAM address is sent, which tells the SPC where to jump execution to when the transfer is complete. The first thing that happens upon a transfer event is waking up the SPC from its wait state. The SNES checks if the SPC is waiting by checking ports 0 and 1 for the values hex AA and BB, then will send over hex CC to get things started. The entry point to the transfer algorithm in the boot ROM is down here. Before the actual data is sent, 1 byte in each of the 4 I/O ports should be sent over by the SNES to tell more about this transfer block. The 16-bit address made by bytes in I/O ports 2 and 3 should hold the location in ARAM to start sending data, or to jump to, depending on part 1. I/O port 1 should contain some non-zero value if we are about to transfer data from the SNES to the APU, and should contain 0 if we are done transferring. I/O port 0 should contain some magic number that the SPC will immediately send back to the SNES after reading these 4 bytes to let it know that it got all of the metadata. This value can be anything non-zero for each block, but it needs to be exactly hex CC for the first block, since that is what the SPC is expecting at first. Next would be the jump instruction that is used when the transfer is complete. The pointer was temporarily stored in memory at address 0, so this jump follows that pointer. If we are transferring data instead, we branch back up here to start receiving data from the SNES CPU. Until now, the two CPUs have been using a magic number to communicate to each other that they have finished reading data over the I/O ports. Now, when sending each data byte, the identifier that will be used to make sure the two CPUs are synced will be a basic counter. At the start of the block, this index will be 0 and count up for each byte sent. After 256 bytes, this index simply overflows. All that is important is that each next byte has an index that is just one higher than the one before it. Even though it seems like this overflow causes the difference to be negative 255, 0 minus hex FF is still 1 when dealing with 8-bit math. The SNES should send 2 bytes at a time, one through I/O port 0, which will be this index, and 1 byte through port 1, which will be the actual data. The SPC will send back the index byte that the SNES sent in order to let it know that it has received the data byte and to send the next one. The only thing left to worry about now is how the SPC knows that the data the SNES sent is valid. The SPC keeps track of its own index byte as well and compares it to the index sent by the SNES. If the SPC's counter is greater than the one currently in the I/O port, this means that the SNES hasn't sent its data byte yet. We're still reading the old data. However, if the two indices match, this means this must be the next data byte we were waiting for. But what happens if the SPC's counter is less than the one in the I/O port? It can't possibly be that we missed a byte, since the SNES should only move on to the next byte after the SPC sends over its index confirming that the data has been read. Have you noticed that the SPC is never actually told how many bytes long this data block will be? Since the data is sent byte for byte in one large block, this means that there's no way to encode a sort of stop message at the end of the data stream. Instead, this discrepancy in the index counter byte is the signal that this data block is complete. It is entirely the SNES's job to count how many bytes need to be sent over and then hijacking the index counter after the last byte is sent. After the SPC notices that the index byte sent is higher than it should be, it will break out of the transfer loop and start working on the next block. Let's focus on the code now. First, the SPC reads all 4 ports as soon as it can, so the SNES doesn't have to wait for too long. It puts the 16-bit address into memory address 0, returns the magic number over I/O port 0, and moves the remaining byte into the X register. If X is 0, the jump is taken indirectly to that pointer in memory, but otherwise, the data transfer code is executed. This spinning loop waits for the SNES to send the first byte with the index counter of 0. This also initializes the SPC's counter to 0, which it holds in the Y register. Then for each byte in the data, this loop runs. After confirming that the indices match, the data is loaded into the accumulator from I/O port 1. The SPC then immediately confirms the data was read by writing the index to I/O port 0. The data is then written to the appropriate location in ARAM. Remember, the pointer to the data location was stored at address 0, so this instruction uses that pointer and the index counter to determine the exact byte to store. The counter is incremented, and the pointer is incremented by hex 100 if the counter overflows. If the indices are found to be not equal, but the SPC's is greater than the SNES's, the I/O port is just read over and over again until they match. But if the SNES's index is larger, execution falls through this loop and back into the entry point of the routine, and the process repeats. Thank you for watching. The next video in this series will be a reference video that quickly revisits every SNES hardware register and how they are used. Then, there will be additional videos that will be about various enhancement chips and a more in-depth analysis of the audio processing unit.